The afternoon sun turned the city pavement into a scorching mirror, but Naomi Carter felt a chill when she heard the sound that didn't belong to the rush of the midday crowd. Not a siren, not a shout. A child's silence, a heavy, suffocating stillness that screamed louder than the traffic of a city too busy to look down. Naomi was still in her waitress uniform, her feet aching from a shift that felt like it would never end, when she spotted her, a little girl in a bright red dress, a vivid splash of color against the gray concrete. She was no older than 5, standing motionless in the center of the sidewalk while the world rushed past. Her eyes were wide, fixed on nothing, her small hands balled into tight white fists. People swerved around her like she was an obstacle in the road. Manhattan's golden rule: ignore the vulnerable, keep moving, stay uninvolved. Naomi didn't keep moving. She crouched down, her caretaker uniform stretching as she made herself small to meet the girl's level. She didn't reach out. She simply existed in that space with her. She whispered in English, then soft melodies, and finally she tapped into a memory, rhythmic breathing and gentle Korean phrases she'd mastered a lifetime ago. At the sound of the familiar cadence, the girl's rigid shoulders dropped. Her shallow gasps turned into deep, shuddering breaths. When Soo-ah finally looked at her, Naomi felt a jolt of recognition, not of a face, but of a shared soul. But as the girl's panic faded, a new shadow fell over them. Black SUVs jumped the curb with military precision. The air suddenly tasted of ozone and expensive cologne. Naomi looked up into the cold, tattooed gaze of Kang Jun-sok, a man whose authority was absolute and whose shadow reached into every corner of the city. By calming the child in the red dress, Naomi had done more than save a lost girl. She had walked into the crosshairs of a Mafia boss who never left anything to chance, and into a world where mercy was the most expensive debt of all. The invitation didn't come as a request. It arrived as a command in the form of a black town car idling outside Naomi's cramped apartment at 6 in the morning. The driver, a man with a neck like a bull and eyes that saw through her, didn't speak a word. He simply opened the door and waited. 20 minutes later, Naomi stood in the center of a midtown penthouse that felt less like a home and more like an observation deck for a god. The floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of a waking Manhattan, but the interior was a study in cold, minimalist violence. Sharp edges, black marble, and a silence so thick it made her ears ring. Jun-sok was sitting behind a desk made of dark, polished wood. He didn't look up when she entered. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, his large, tattooed hands resting flat on the surface. Between them lay a single, weathered manila folder. "Sit, Miss Carter," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the kind that vibrated in a person's marrow. Naomi sat, her back straight, her waitress uniform replaced by the only clean blouse she owned. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. Jun-sok finally looked up, his dark eyes scanning her face with a terrifying clinical intensity. He flipped the folder open. Naomi Elizabeth Carter, 26, born in Chicago, moved to New York 3 years ago after your mother's medical debts liquidated your family's estate. Naomi flinched. The debt was a private wound, a ghost she'd been running from across 3 different jobs. "You have a degree in early childhood development that you can't use because you couldn't afford the licensing fees," he continued, his finger tracing a line on a paper she couldn't see. "You spent 18 months volunteering at a specialized clinic in Seoul during a study abroad program. That's where you learned the language. That's where you learned how to talk to children like my daughter." He slid a photograph across the desk. It was Naomi's own high school graduation picture, one she hadn't seen in years. Underneath it was a copy of her bank statement, the balance highlighted in a cruel, mocking yellow. "You're 3 months behind on rent. You skip dinner twice a week to save on groceries. And yet, he paused, his gaze hardening. When you saw a child in distress yesterday, you didn't look at her like a paycheck. You looked at her like a human being. Naomi found her voice, though it was small. I didn't do it for you. I did it because she was scared. Jun-sok closed the folder with a sharp thud. The sound echoed in the vast room. I don't care why you did it. I only care that you are the only person Soo-ah has responded to in 2 years. He leaned forward, the onus shadow of his heavy frame falling over her. I am going to buy your time, Miss Carter. I am going to buy your loyalty, your expertise, and your silence. In exchange, your debts will vanish by noon today. He watched her, waiting for the fear to turn into greed, but Naomi only felt the weight of the golden cage door swinging shut. She looked at the paper trail of her life on his desk and realized that in this room, she wasn't a person, she was an investment, and Kang Jun-sok never made an investment he didn't intend to control completely. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that sounded like a countdown. Jun-sok pushed a sleek fountain pen toward Naomi. Its barrel was cold, heavy, and tipped in gold, a tool for signing away a soul. $30,000 a month, Jun-sok stated, his voice devoid of emotion. An amount that ensures your total devotion to my daughter. But you must understand, Naomi, this isn't a typical nanny position. You are now part of this household's security perimeter. Naomi looked at the contract. The text was a blur of legal jargon, but certain phrases stood out like warning flares. Exclusive service, non-disclosure of all family activities, continuous residency. What does 24-hour protection mean? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Jun-sok leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. It means that from this moment on, you do not walk the streets alone. You do not go to the grocery store without an escort. You do not exist outside the shadow of my men. My enemies look for gaps in my armor, Naomi. Yesterday, you became a part of that armor. If you are to be near Sua, you must be as shielded as she is. He watched her, his gaze lingering on the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. To him, she was a miracle worker who had unlocked his daughter's silence. To his enemies, she was a soft target. Naomi thought of her landlord's weekly threats and the stack of red-inked medical bills sitting on her kitchen table. She thought of the way Sua's small hand had felt in hers, cold and trembling, then slowly relaxing. She realized this wasn't just a job offer, it was a gilded cage. To save her life and the girl's progress, she had to stop being a private citizen and start being a possession. She picked up the pen. The weight of it felt like a brand. With a swift, fluid motion, she signed her name at the bottom of the final page. The moment the ink dried, the 2 men in dark suits who had been standing by the elevator stepped forward. They didn't smile. They didn't greet her. They simply stood on either side of her, their presence a physical wall between her and the world she used to know. Take Miss Carter to her quarters, Jun-sok ordered, already turning his attention back to his monitors. Her old life is concluded. See that she has everything she needs for the transition. As Naomi was led toward the elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished marble walls. She was still wearing her waitress uniform, but she looked like a stranger. She had signed for the money, but as the elevator doors hissed shut, locking her into the heights of the King Empire, she realized the protection was just another word for a leash, one made of the purest gold and impossible to break. The car ride to Brooklyn Heights was a funeral procession for Naomi's former life. Outside the tinted windows, the world continued in its frantic, messy rhythm, but inside the SUV, there was only the clinical scent of leather and the heavy silence of her 2 shadows. When they finally pulled up to the brownstone, it looked less like a home and more like a cathedral of secrets. It was a massive, ivy-covered fortress of red brick and wrought iron, overlooking the gray expanse of the East River. The interior was even colder. As Naomi stepped over the threshold, her footsteps were swallowed by thick silk rugs. The air was still, devoid of the normal sounds of a household. No humming refrigerator, no distant television, no laughter. It was a house that held its breath. Standing at the base of the grand staircase was a woman who seemed carved from the same marble as the foyer. She was older, her silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, wearing a traditional hanbok that was as sharp and black as a raven's wing. This was the aunt, the woman who managed the Kang household with the iron discipline of a general. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she walked a slow circle around Naomi, her eyes like shards of ice, assessing the fit of her uniform, the calluses on her hands, and the way she held her head. Naomi felt like a servant being inspected for flaws before a royal banquet. "You are the girl from the street," the aunt said, her English perfect and brittle. "Jun-sok believes you have a gift. I believe you are a complication." "I'm here to help Sua," Naomi replied, keeping her voice level despite the prickle of sweat at her hairline. "Many have come to help," the aunt countered, stepping closer until the scent of sandalwood and old paper filled Naomi's senses. "Professionals with more degrees than you have years of life. They all failed. They all left because they feared the silence of this house, or they feared the man who owns it." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do not mistake his desperation for kindness, Miss Carter. You are here because you are a tool. If you break, or if you fail to sharpen the child's mind, you will be discarded just as quickly as the rest." She gestured toward the upper floors. "The girl is in the solarium. She has not eaten since yesterday. See that she does. And Miss Carter, do not wander. In this house, doors are locked for a reason." As the aunt swept away, her silk skirts hissing against the floor, Naomi looked up the dark staircase. She felt the weight of the cameras hidden in the molding and the armed men stationed at the exits. She was in the heart of the fortress now, surrounded by stone and suspicion, with only the distant, ghostly memory of a child's silent cry to guide her through the dark. The solarium was a glass cage filled with the dying amber light of the afternoon. Sua sat in the center of a white rug, surrounded by expensive toys that looked untouched, her gaze fixed on a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam. She was a statue in a red dress, perfectly still and perfectly silent. Naomi didn't approach her directly. She knew the weight of an expectant gaze could feel like a physical blow to a child like Sua. Instead, Naomi sat on the floor a few feet away and opened a small wooden box she had insisted on bringing from her apartment. She didn't offer a greeting, she simply began to play. She hummed a low, resonant tone, the kind that vibrates in the chest rather than the throat. Slowly, she began to tap a rhythmic pattern on a small kalimba, the metal tines ringing out with a soft, watery clarity. Plink, plink, plank. It was a simple, repetitive melody, a heartbeat in song. For 30 minutes, nothing changed. Then, the first crack in the ice appeared. Sua's pinky finger twitched in time with the rhythm. Naomi didn't jump. She didn't cheer. She reached into her box and pulled out a jar of heavy, iridescent kinetic sand. She began to mold it, the sound of the grains sliding against each other creating a soft, hushing noise. She held a handful out, not toward Sua's face, but toward her hand. The silence stretched, agonizingly thin, until a small, pale hand reached out. Sua's fingers sank into the sand. The sensory input seemed to ground her, anchoring her wandering mind back into her body. Naomi leaned in, her voice a feather-light murmur, speaking the Korean nursery rhyme about the moon that she had practiced until her tongue ached. Dal, dal, musin dal. She stopped mid-sentence, leaving the rhyme hanging in the air like an unfinished bridge. She waited, her own breath held tight in her lungs. From the doorway, she felt the heavy, silent presence of Jun-sok. He was watching from the shadows, his frame filling the entrance, his face a mask of restrained desperation. He looked like a man watching a miracle or a car wreck, unsure which would happen first. Then, it happened. It wasn't a shout or a clear sentence. It was a sound as fragile as breaking glass, a tiny, raspy exhale that shaped the next word of the song. Dal. A whisper. One single word, rusted from 2 years of disuse, but it was there. Sua's eyes, normally vacant, suddenly flooded with a terrifyingly bright awareness as they met Naomi's. In the doorway, Naomi heard the sharp, staggered intake of Jun-sok's breath. The Mafia boss, the man who ruled through fear, let his forehead rest against the doorframe, his shoulders shaking with a silent, violent relief. The silence of the house hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered. Naomi looked from the child to the monster in the doorway and realized that by giving the girl back her voice, she had just made herself the most indispensable and the most endangered person in the Kang Empire. The breakthrough in the solarium had shifted the atmosphere of the house from a tomb to something more akin to a waiting room. The silence was no longer heavy with despair, but with a fragile, aching hope. Late that night, when the moon hung like a silver sickle over the East River, a shadow appeared at Naomi's door. It was Jun-sok, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate dark ink that mapped his forearms. "Follow me," he said, his voice stripped of its usual command. He led her to a wing of the brownstone that had remained behind locked doors since her arrival. When he pushed the final set of double doors open, the scent of linseed oil, turpentine, and dust greeted them. It was a massive art studio, bathed in the blue glow of the moon. Half-finished canvases leaned against the walls, and brushes sat dry in porcelain jars, as if the artist had only stepped out for a moment. "My wife's," Jun-sok whispered, his presence seemingly smaller among the ghosts of the room. The police called it a random act of violence, a botched robbery, but in my world, there is no such thing as random. He walked to the center of the room where a large easel was draped in a white sheet. With a hesitant hand, he pulled the fabric away. It was a portrait of Sua, captured in mid-laugh, her eyes bright with a joy Naomi had yet to see in person. "She was the light that kept the shadows of my business at bay," he said, his gaze fixed on the painting. "When she was killed, the light went out, for me and for Sua. The doctors called it selective mutism, a trauma response, but I knew the truth. She was waiting for a world that didn't feel like a threat." He turned to Naomi, and for the first time, she didn't see the Mafia boss who ruled the city with an iron fist. She saw a man hollowed out by grief, a father who would burn the world down just to hear his daughter laugh again. "You brought a sound into this house today that I thought I'd never hear again," he said, stepping into her personal space. The air between them grew thick, charged with a sudden, dangerous vulnerability. "The aunt thinks you are a tool. My men think you are a liability. But I see what you are, Naomi." He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, a touch that was surprisingly gentle, yet carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. "You are the bridge back to the living, and I find myself wondering if you are only here for the child, or if fate brought you here for me too." Naomi looked into his eyes and saw the monster and the man warring for dominance. She knew she should pull away, that getting close to a man like Jun-sok was like leaning into a flame. But in the quiet of the Shrine of Ghosts, she found herself staying exactly where she was. The next nights in the Brooklyn Heights brownstone were restless, the silence of the halls no longer empty, but filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Driven by a thirst she couldn't quench and thoughts she couldn't quiet, Naomi slipped out of her room long after the house had supposedly gone to sleep. The kitchen was a cavern of brushed steel and shadows, illuminated only by the cold blue light of the industrial refrigerator. Naomi was reaching for a glass of water when a flicker of movement near the island made her heart lurch. Jun-sok was there, leaning against the marble counter with a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the tattoos on his neck stark and predatory in the dim light. He looked less like a king in that moment and more like a man haunted by the very empire he ruled. "The silence is louder at night, isn't it?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to pull the air from the room. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Naomi whispered, clutching her glass. "I was just restless." "Restless is a dangerous way to be in this house, Naomi." He moved then, not with his usual calculated precision, but with a slow, magnetic pull. He stopped only inches away, the scent of expensive bourbon and cold rain clinging to him. "You've turned this house upside down. My daughter speaks, my aunt is unsettled, and I—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips. The professional boundary they had built, the contract, the money, the roles of employer and employee began to fray like a rope under too much tension. Naomi knew she should walk away. She knew that getting closer to a man like Kang Jun-sok was an invitation to a chaos she might not survive. But when he reached out, his hand sliding into her hair to tilt her face toward his, she didn't pull back. "You shouldn't be here," he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "I know." The collision was inevitable. When he finally leaned in, the kiss wasn't a gentle inquiry, it was a desperate, starving claim. It tasted of smoke and secrets, a frantic blurring of lines that changed everything. For a moment there was no mafia boss and no waitress, only two people clinging to each other in the dark, trying to find something solid in a world made of shadows. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was ragged, his thumb bruising the soft skin of her lower lip. The cold reality of the house rushed back in, the cameras, the guards, the 24-hour protection that was now as much a threat as a promise. "Go back to your room, Naomi," he said, his voice hardening back into the mask of the boss, though his eyes remained dark with a hunger he couldn't hide. "Before we both forget that you're here to save my daughter, not to lose yourself to me." Naomi fled into the shadows of the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs, realizing that the golden leash hadn't just tightened, it had become a lifeline she wasn't sure she wanted to break. The studio was no longer a tomb, it had become Naomi's sanctuary. Encouraged by Jun-sok to use the space to connect with Soo-ah through art, Naomi found herself surrounded by the vibrant, unfinished legacy of a woman she had never met. While Soo-ah sat on the floor nearby, meticulously mixing primary colors into a peaceful violet, Naomi stood before a blank canvas, trying to process the electric, terrifying memory of the kitchen encounter. The air in the room was thick with the scent of turpentine and old secrets. As Naomi reached for a palette knife, a low murmur of voices drifted through the heavy oak doors leading to the private study next door. Usually, the brownstone was a fortress of silence, but the ventilation duct carried the conversation with chilling clarity. "The girl is getting better," a voice rasped. It was the aunt, her tone stripped of its usual icy composure. "She's starting to remember things, Jun-sok. If she speaks about that night, about what she actually saw, your internal liabilities will become a death warrant for the board." Naomi froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Soo-ah, who remained blissfully absorbed in her paints, unaware that the air around her had turned toxic. "I know the risks," Jun-sok's voice boomed, though it sounded weary, weighted by 1,000 tons of guilt. "Do you?" the aunt hissed. "You let the world believe it was a botched robbery by a rival faction. You let the lie protect the family business. But if the child identifies her mother's own security detail, if she points to the men you hired, the council will purge us all. You are protecting the girl with one hand and harboring her mother's killers with the other." Naomi felt the world tilt. The botched robbery hadn't been an external attack. It was an execution from within the Kang Empire. The men in the hallways, the protection that followed her every move, some of them were the very monsters who had shattered Soo-ah's world.
A heavy silence followed, punctuated only by the rhythmic shuck-shuck of Sua's brush against the paper. "The waitress," the aunt continued, her tone a sharp edge. "She's getting too close. She isn't just a bridge for the child anymore. She's a witness to your weakness. If she learns the
truth, she becomes the ultimate liability. You know what has to be done with liabilities, Jun-sok?" Naomi stepped back, her heel catching on a stray paint jar. The clatter seemed to echo through the entire house. She stared at the unfinished portrait of the late Mrs. Kang, the woman's painted eyes suddenly feeling like a warning. She wasn't just a caretaker in a mansion. She was a woman standing in a glass house, and the stones were already beginning to fly. The blood drained from Naomi's face as the realization of the betrayal sank in, but she had no time to process the horror. The heavy silence of the brownstone was suddenly shattered by a sound like a thunderclap, the front doors exploding inward. The house's security alarms began to wail, a high-pitched, rhythmic screaming that sent Sua into an immediate, violent spiral. The child dropped her brushes, her hands flying to her ears as she let out a piercing, wordless shriek. Naomi's instincts kicked in. She didn't look for the guards. She didn't know which ones to trust anymore. She grabbed Sua, pulling the small, shaking body against her chest. "Sua, look at me! Breathe with me!" Naomi shouted over the din. Automatic gunfire erupted downstairs, the rapid fire pop, 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 shaking the floorboards. Through the studio's internal monitors, Naomi saw chaos, men in tactical gear swarming the foyer. This wasn't just a purge, it was an invasion. Whether they were rival factions or the internal liabilities the aunt had mentioned, they were here to finish what had started 2 years ago. Naomi realized the main exits were death traps. She remembered the late wife's sketches of the house, a hidden service corridor meant for staff to move unnoticed between the studio and the basement garage. But the entrance was a trick of the paneling, and Sua was too deep in a sensory crisis to move. "Sua, listen to the song," Naomi urgently whispered against the girl's head. She began to chant the rhythmic Korean nursery rhyme they had practiced, but she changed the cadence, turning the lyrics into a series of directions. Left foot, moon step. Right foot, star hide. It was their secret language, the sensory grounding techniques they had built together. Sua's eyes flickered, focusing on Naomi's lips. She began to move, not out of logic, but out of the conditioned rhythm of the game. They slipped through the concealed door behind a massive tapestry just as the studio doors were kicked off their hinges. The corridor was narrow, smelling of damp stone and insulation. Bullets thudded into the walls behind them, the muffled shouts of men echoing in the crawlspace. Naomi's heart felt like it was going to burst, but she kept the rhythm going, her voice a low, steady anchor in the dark. They reached the basement garage, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and exhaust. Jun-sok was there, standing behind an armored SUV, his shirt stained with blood, his handgun leveled at the service door. When he saw Naomi and Sua emerge, his face transformed from a mask of cold death into one of raw, frantic relief. "Get in the car!" he roared, covering them as he laid down a wall of suppressive fire toward the stairwell. As the armored vehicles sped out of the garage and into the rain-slicked streets of Brooklyn, Naomi looked back at the fortress. She was safe, but the cost was clear. She was no longer just a caretaker. She was a fugitive in a war where the lines between protector and predator had finally vanished. The safe house was a glass-walled sanctuary perched high above the coast, miles away from the smoke and betrayal of Brooklyn Heights. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean churned with a restless gray energy, mirroring the silent storm inside the house. Naomi stood by the window watching the waves when she felt a presence behind her. She didn't flinch. She had learned the weight of Jun-sok's footsteps, the specific way the air changed when he entered a room. He was bandaged, his arm in a sling, but his gaze remained as sharp and protective as the day they met. "The aunt has been relocated," Jun-sok said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room.
The men who worked for her, the ones who stood while my wife was taken, they will never trouble us again. But the council is fractured. There are others who see Sua's recovery as a threat to their power. Naomi turned to face him. The waitress, who had lived in fear of rent hikes and medical bills, felt like a ghost from a different life. In her place was a woman who had carried a child through a war zone, using nothing but a nursery rhyme and a prayer. They think she's a liability because she can speak, but she isn't just a witness. She's the reason you're still human, Jun-sok, and I won't let them take that from her, or from you. From the next room, the soft sound of a piano drifted toward them. It was Sua, tentatively picking out the notes of the melody Naomi had taught her. She wasn't hiding in the silence anymore. She was reaching out to the world, one note at a time. Jun-sok stepped closer, his good hand coming up to rest on the windowpane behind Naomi, effectively surrounding her. You could have run, Naomi. In the garage, when the doors opened, you could have kept going. I would have made sure you were taken care of. You didn't have to get on this plane. I signed a contract, she whispered, a small, defiant smile touching her lips. 24-hour protection, remember? I just didn't realize at the time that I'd be protecting you, too. He looked at her then, not as a master looking at a tool, but as a man looking at his equal. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, a silent vow passing between them in the salt-tinged air. The golden leash had vanished, replaced by a bond forged in blood and moonlight. The war isn't over, Jun-sok murmured against her skin. They will come for us. They will try to pull us back into the dark. Let them come, Naomi replied, reaching out to take his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. As the sun began to break through the Atlantic mist, Naomi watched the light hit the water. They were outcasts, survivors, and monsters in the eyes of the world, but as Sua called out for Nana from the other room, Naomi knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The shadows were long, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the dark.